The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard as Maria Delgado pressed her face against the cold iron bars. Her newborn daughter slept fitfully in her arms, tiny fists clenched against the harsh reality that had become their world. The baby's soft breathing was the only sound that brought Maria any comfort in this place of concrete walls and desperate whispers. 3 months had passed since the judge's gavel fell, sealing her fate with words that still echoed in her mind. Guilty of drug trafficking. The evidence had been planted, she knew it, but her court-appointed lawyer barely looked up from his notes during the trial. Her ex-boyfriend, Carlos, had vanished the night before her arrest, leaving behind only empty promises and a bag of cocaine hidden in her closet that she never knew existed. The other women in the prison kept their distance. Maria understood why. She was different from them, with her college education and dreams that once reached beyond the barrio where she grew up. But those dreams felt like stories from someone else's life now. Her daughter, Isabella, would grow up visiting her mother through glass windows and speaking through telephone receivers. Maria's cellmate Rosa had been kind enough to help with the baby during those first terrible weeks. Rosa was serving time for armed robbery, but her weathered hands were gentle when she changed Isabella's diapers or sang soft lullabies in Spanish. "The little one needs her mama strong," Rosa would say when Maria broke down crying in the middle of the night. The prison nursery program allowed mothers to keep their babies for the first 18 months, but every day that passed felt like a countdown to heartbreak. Maria watched other women say goodbye to their children, their faces crumbling as social workers carried away the most precious things in their lives. She couldn't bear to think about that day coming for her and Isabella. Letters from her family had stopped coming after the first month. Her mother was too ashamed to face the neighbors' questions. Her younger brother Miguel had always looked up to her, but now she wondered if he even told his friends he had a sister. The isolation was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Carlos was probably living free while she paid for his crimes. The days blended together in a routine of head counts, cafeteria meals that tasted like cardboard, and yard time where the sun felt too bright after hours under fluorescent lights. Maria tried to stay strong for Isabella, but some nights she lay awake wondering if her daughter would be better off adopted by a family who could give her a real life. Dr. Thompson, the prison psychologist, visited twice a week. She encouraged Maria to write letters, even if she never sent them. "It helps process the anger," she explained. Maria filled notebook after notebook with words she wished she could say to Carlos, to the lawyer who failed her, to the judge who looked right through her as if she wasn't even human. The library became Maria's refuge during the hours when Isabella napped. She read everything she could find about the legal system, searching for some loophole or precedent that might help her case. The other inmates thought she was crazy for trying, but Maria refused to accept that this was how her story would end. Winter arrived early that year, bringing cold winds that whistled through the prison windows. Maria wrapped Isabella in every blanket she could find, whispering promises about the world outside these walls. She told her daughter about the small apartment they would have someday, with yellow walls and flowers on the windowsill. She described walks in the park and bedtime stories and all the normal things that other mothers took for granted. But as the months wore on, hope felt more and more like a luxury Maria couldn't afford. The appeals process was slow and expensive, and her savings had been drained by legal fees before the trial even began. Her public defender had filed the paperwork, but he warned her not to expect miracles. Cases like hers rarely got overturned, especially without new evidence. The other inmates had their own theories about justice and survival. Some advised her to keep her head down and serve her time quietly. Others whispered about connections on the outside who could make problems disappear for the right price. Maria listened but trusted none of them. She had learned the hard way that trusting the wrong person could destroy everything. On quiet nights, when Isabella finally fell asleep and the prison settled into its restless rhythm, Maria allowed herself to remember who she used to be. She had been a teacher before all this, working with kids who reminded her of herself at that age. They had believed in her, looked up to her, and she had failed them by ending up here. The guilt was almost worse than the anger. Isabella's first steps happened in the prison yard on a Thursday morning in March. Maria watched her daughter toddle across the concrete, arms outstretched for balance, and felt her heart break and soar at the same time. This should have been happening in their living room, with grandparents cheering and a camera ready to capture the moment. Instead, it was witnessed by guards and inmates, filed away as just another day in their institutional life. The approaching 18-month deadline loomed over everything now. Social workers visited more frequently, asking questions about Maria's plans and support system. They spoke in gentle voices about what was best for Isabella, but Maria could see the pity in their eyes. They had already decided her daughter's fate, and she was powerless to change it. Maria's appeals had been denied twice. Her lawyer explained the process with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. "We can try the state Supreme Court," he said, but they both knew it was a formality. Cases like hers were statistics, not stories. The system was designed to move forward, not to stop and examine whether justice had actually been served. Sleep became impossible as the date grew closer. Maria would lie in her narrow bunk, listening to Isabella's soft breathing and trying to memorize every detail of her daughter's face. The way her eyes lit up when she saw Maria in the morning. The sound of her laugh when they played peekaboo. The weight of her small body when she fell asleep in Maria's arms. These memories would have to last through years of separation. Other women tried to offer comfort, sharing their own stories of loss and separation. Carmen had lost 2 children to the system and spoke about the phone calls and letters that kept her connected. "They remember you," she insisted. "Love doesn't disappear because of walls." But Maria saw the hollow look in Carmen's eyes when she thought no one was watching. The prison chapel became Maria's second refuge. She hadn't been religious before, but desperation had a way of opening doors that logic kept closed. Father Martinez, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, visited twice a week. He listened without judgment as Maria poured out her fears and anger. "Faith isn't about understanding God's plan," he told her. "It's about holding on when nothing makes sense." Isabella was walking everywhere now, exploring every corner of their small world with the fearless curiosity of childhood. She babbled constantly, mixing Spanish and English words that only Maria could understand. The other inmates had adopted her as their collective daughter, slipping her extra crackers from their meals and making toys from whatever materials they could find. Maria started teaching English classes for the Spanish-speaking inmates, partly to keep her mind occupied and partly because she needed to feel useful again. Education had always been her passion, and even here, surrounded by concrete and despair, she found purpose in helping others learn. The women were eager students, many of them mothers themselves who wanted to help their children with homework during visits. Letters began arriving from an unexpected source. Miguel, her younger brother, had started writing again after months of silence. His first letter was awkward and full of apologies, but slowly he began sharing details about his life. He was finishing high school and working part-time at a mechanic's shop. He had been angry and embarrassed, he admitted, but their mother had finally told him the truth about Carlos and the planted evidence. The revelation that her family finally believed her innocence brought both relief and fresh pain. They had wasted so much time, and now there was so little left before Isabella would be taken away. Miguel promised to visit soon, but the prison's location made it a difficult trip for a teenager with limited resources. Maria's routine expanded to include more activities. She joined the debate team, channeled her anger into arguments about criminal justice reform and prison conditions. The other team members were surprised by her passion and knowledge. "You should have been a lawyer," one of them joked, not knowing how deeply the comment cut. Dr. Thompson continued their sessions, focusing now on preparing Maria for the separation from Isabella. They practiced coping strategies and discussed ways to maintain the mother-daughter bond across distance and time. "This isn't the end of your relationship," she insisted. "It's a painful interruption, but not the end." The social workers brought paperwork and forms, legal documents that would transfer Isabella to temporary foster care while they searched for a permanent placement. They spoke hopefully about finding a family who would maintain contact, maybe even allow visits. But Maria had heard these promises before from other women, and she knew how quickly good intentions faded when dealing with the complications of a mother in prison. Spring brought warmer weather and longer days in the yard. Maria spent every possible moment outside with Isabella, teaching her the names of flowers that grew along the fence and pointing out clouds in the sky. She sang to her in both languages, the lullabies her own mother had sung years ago and new songs she made up about bravery and love that transcends walls. The countdown felt relentless now. Weeks became days, and days slipped away like water through her fingers. Maria began writing letters to Isabella, sealed envelopes to be opened on future birthdays and important occasions. She wrote about family history and dreams for the future, trying to compress 18 years of motherhood into pages that a stranger would eventually deliver. Other inmates offered advice based on their own experiences. Some suggested making the separation quick and clean, like pulling off a bandage. Others recommended a gradual transition, preparing Isabella for the change over several days. But nothing could really prepare either of them for what was coming. The approaching separation felt like a death, except the person you were losing would continue living somewhere else, beyond your reach. The morning they took Isabella away, Maria thought her heart would stop beating. The social worker arrived early, carrying a small pink suitcase that someone had donated for children in transition. Isabella clung to Maria's shirt, sensing something wrong but too young to understand why everyone looked so sad. Maria tried to smile, tried to make it seem normal, but tears kept falling despite her efforts to stay strong. "We found a good family," the social worker explained gently. "The Johnsons have experience with children from difficult situations. They understand the importance of maintaining connections." But her words felt hollow against the reality of watching strangers walk away with the most precious thing in Maria's life. The silence in the cell afterward was unbearable. Rosa tried to comfort her, but Maria couldn't hear anything beyond the echo of Isabella's confused crying as she was carried down the hallway. For 3 days, Maria refused to eat or leave her bunk. The world felt emptied of color and purpose. Dr. Thompson visited more frequently during those first weeks. She brought photos that the foster family had sent, showing Isabella playing in a backyard with toys and flowers. "She's adjusting well," the doctor reported. But Maria could see the uncertainty in her daughter's eyes even in the pictures. Isabella was too young to understand abandonment, but old enough to feel the absence of the person who had been her entire world. Letters from the Johnsons arrived weekly at first. They wrote about Isabella's milestones, her favorite foods, the way she looked for Maria in every room when she first arrived. Mrs. Johnson seemed genuinely caring, describing how they had set up a special photo album with pictures of Maria so Isabella wouldn't forget her mother's face. But as months passed, the letters became shorter and less frequent. Maria threw herself into her studies, earning her GED and starting college courses through the prison education program. She majored in social work, driven by a newfound understanding of how the system failed people like her. Her professors were impressed by her passion and insight, but Maria felt like she was living someone else's life. Everything she learned, every achievement felt meaningless without Isabella there to witness it. The debate team became her outlet for anger and frustration. Maria argued cases about criminal justice reform with the intensity of someone fighting for her life. Her teammates nicknamed her the prosecutor because of her relentless preparation and powerful delivery. She won several competitions, earning privileges and recognition that felt empty without someone who mattered to share them with. Miguel finally visited during the summer, bringing photos of their neighborhood and updates about their mother's health. He looked older, more serious than the carefree teenager Maria remembered. "Mama wants to write," he said carefully, "but she doesn't know what to say." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. The visit was awkward at first. 3 years of separation had changed them both. Miguel was working full-time now and had a girlfriend who didn't know about Maria's situation. He spoke carefully about the future, avoiding promises he might not be able to keep. But when visiting time ended, he hugged her tightly and whispered, "I never stopped believing you." Maria's legal situation remained unchanged despite her efforts to find new representation. The original evidence had been destroyed according to standard protocol, and Carlos had disappeared completely. Without new evidence or witnesses, her conviction stood firm. The public defender who handled her appeals resigned from the case, citing a lack of resources to pursue further action. Prison life settled into a routine that felt both familiar and strange without Isabella. Maria mentored new mothers in the nursery program, helping them navigate the system and prepare for the inevitable separations. She saw her own story reflected in their faces, the same mixture of hope and desperation she had carried for 18 months. The holidays were particularly difficult. Maria imagined Isabella's second Christmas, wondering if she was old enough to understand Santa Claus or if the Johnsons celebrated the same traditions. She made crafts in the prison workshop, small toys and decorations that she mailed to the foster family with letters explaining their significance. Some packages were acknowledged, others seemed to disappear into the void of bureaucracy. Father Martinez continued their conversations, focusing now on forgiveness and finding purpose in suffering. "Your pain isn't meaningless," he insisted during one particularly dark session. "It's teaching you something about compassion that you can't learn any other way." Maria wanted to believe him, but some days the lessons felt too expensive to be worth learning. The prison introduced a new program for inmates pursuing higher education. Maria was selected to participate in video conferences with law schools, sharing her experiences with students studying criminal justice reform. Speaking to these bright young people about systemic failures and the human cost of injustice gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since becoming a mother. One student, a serious young woman named Sarah, began corresponding with Maria regularly. She was writing her thesis on wrongful convictions and asked detailed questions about Maria's case. Her letters were different from the others, more analytical, less emotional. She asked about evidence preservation and witness testimony, about the quality of legal representation and the appeals process. As winter returned, Maria realized she had been in prison for over 3 years. Isabella would be walking and talking now, probably calling someone else Mama. The thought was both devastating and oddly freeing. Maria had spent so much energy trying to maintain a connection that might already be broken. Perhaps it was time to focus on building something new from the pieces of her shattered life. The education program offered her a chance to earn a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. Maria threw herself into the work, studying late into the night by the light of her small desk lamp. Her grades were excellent, and professors began to notice her insights and dedication. One criminology instructor suggested she consider law school after her release, but that future still felt impossibly distant. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered with the usual stack of mail that rarely contained anything surprising. Maria almost set it aside, assuming it was another form letter or administrative notice. But something about the return address caught her attention. It was from a law firm she didn't recognize, located in Phoenix, Arizona. Inside was a carefully typed letter from an attorney named David Yazzie. He identified himself as a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe and explained that he had been following her case through Sarah, the law student who had been corresponding with Maria. Sarah was his niece, and she had shared Maria's story during a family gathering. David specialized in cases involving prosecutorial misconduct and had agreed to review Maria's file. Maria read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. David believed there were grounds for a new appeal based on ineffective assistance of counsel and possible evidence tampering. He had already begun preliminary research and wanted to schedule a visit to discuss the case in detail. For the first time in years, Maria felt something that resembled hope stirring in her chest. The visit was scheduled for the following month. Maria spent weeks preparing, gathering every document and note she had accumulated during her time in prison. She reviewed her original trial transcripts until she could recite them from memory. Dr. Thompson helped her organize her thoughts and manage her expectations. "Hope is good," she cautioned, "but prepare yourself for disappointment too." David Yazzie arrived on a cold March morning, carrying a worn leather briefcase and an air of quiet competence that immediately put Maria at ease. He was younger than she had expected, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a way of listening that made her feel heard for the first time since her arrest. He asked detailed questions about her relationship with Carlos, the timeline of events leading to her arrest, and the behavior of her original attorney. "Your lawyer made several critical errors," David explained after reviewing her case files. "He failed to investigate Carlos's background, didn't request lab testing on the evidence, and never filed motions that could have challenged the search of your apartment. Any one of these failures might be grounds for appeal, but together they paint a clear picture of inadequate representation." Maria felt tears threatening as David outlined his strategy. He had already located Carlos through a private investigator and discovered that he had been arrested twice for drug trafficking since fleeing. More importantly, he had found evidence that Carlos had connections to the police officer who conducted the original search of Maria's apartment. The connections suggested possible corruption that had never been investigated. The process would be long and expensive, David warned. Appeals courts were reluctant to overturn convictions, especially in drug cases, but he believed Maria's case was strong enough to warrant the effort. He worked on a contingency basis for clients who couldn't afford his fees, taking payment only if they won. Sarah had convinced him that Maria's case represented exactly the kind of injustice he had dedicated his career to fighting. While David began the legal work, Maria focused on completing her bachelor's degree. She was only 6 credits away from graduation, and the accomplishment felt more important now that freedom might be possible. Her professors in the education program had become unofficial mentors, encouraging her to pursue graduate studies in teaching. One offered to write a recommendation letter for law school applications, despite knowing she might not be able to use it for years. Letters from Isabella had stopped coming entirely. The Johnsons had moved to another state, according to the last communication from social services, and the new caseworker was less responsive to Maria's inquiries. The silence was painful, but Maria tried to focus on the possibility that Isabella was thriving in a stable environment. Sometimes love meant accepting distance if it served the other person's happiness. Miguel visited more regularly now, bringing news about their mother's gradual acceptance of the situation. She had started attending a support group for families of incarcerated individuals and was slowly learning to separate shame from love. She wants to write, Miguel reported after his latest visit, but she's afraid of saying the wrong thing. Maria dictated a letter to him, simple words of forgiveness and understanding that she hoped would bridge the gap between them. The seasons changed while David worked on the appeal. Maria maintained her routine of classes, tutoring, and debate team practice, but everything felt different now. Hope was dangerous in prison, where disappointment could destroy months of carefully built emotional stability. She tried to stay grounded in the present while allowing herself to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible just months before. David's visits became monthly events. He brought updates on his investigation and copies of documents he had uncovered. Carlos had indeed been working as an informant for the police department, receiving money and reduced charges in exchange for information about drug dealers in Maria's neighborhood. The arrangement had never been disclosed to Maria's defense team, a violation that could invalidate her conviction. The investigating officer, Detective Morrison, had retired shortly after Maria's trial and moved to Florida. David's investigator had located him and discovered a pattern of questionable cases and early retirements that suggested departmental pressure to close cases quickly. Morrison had initially refused to speak with the investigator, but David was exploring legal options to compel his testimony. Prison rumors traveled fast, and news of Maria's appeal spread through the population like wildfire. Some women offered encouragement and support, while others warned her not to get her hopes up. "The system doesn't admit mistakes," warned Linda, a lifer who had seen dozens of appeals fail. "They'd rather keep an innocent woman locked up than admit they were wrong." But Rosa, her old cellmate who had since been transferred to minimum security, sent encouraging letters through friends. "You always knew this day would come," she wrote. "We could see it in your eyes even when you couldn't see it yourself. You never belonged here, and now someone with power finally sees it too." Maria's education counselor suggested she begin preparing for life outside prison, even though the appeal might take another year or more. She enrolled in job readiness classes and began researching social work programs near her hometown. The planning felt premature and dangerous, like counting money before winning the lottery, but it also felt necessary. If freedom came, she wanted to be ready to build something meaningful from the years of loss and struggle. The breakthrough came on a humid August morning when David arrived at the prison with an expression Maria had never seen before. His usual professional calm was replaced by barely contained excitement as he spread documents across the small table in the visiting room. Carlos had been arrested again, this time for trafficking heroin across state lines and facing life imprisonment. He had decided to cooperate with federal authorities. "He's willing to testify about the planted evidence," David explained, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. "The federal prosecutor handling his case contacted me yesterday. Carlos wants to make a deal, and part of that deal involves coming clean about your case. He's admitted to planting the drugs in your apartment and identified Detective Morrison as his contact." Maria felt the room spinning slightly as the implications sank in. After nearly 5 years of fighting for recognition of her innocence, the truth was finally emerging from the shadows. Carlos had detailed how Morrison had pressured him to set up dealers in exchange for reduced sentences, and how Maria had been chosen simply because she was Carlos's ex-girlfriend and had keys to the apartment. The federal investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning several years. Morrison had manipulated multiple cases using informants like Carlos, planting evidence when necessary to secure convictions and boost his department's statistics. At least 12 other cases were being reviewed, and the scandal was already making headlines in the local newspapers. David filed an emergency motion for a new trial based on the new evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. The district attorney's office, facing potential lawsuits and federal investigation, was surprisingly cooperative. Within 2 weeks, a hearing was scheduled to review Maria's case. The possibility that had seemed distant for so long was suddenly racing toward reality. Maria spent those 2 weeks in a strange state of suspended animation. Part of her wanted to celebrate, to plan for freedom and reunion with her family. But experience had taught her that hope could be dangerous, and she tried to maintain the emotional equilibrium that had sustained her through years of disappointment. Dr. Thompson helped her process the conflicting emotions, the mixture of excitement and terror that came with the possibility of dramatic change. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in September. Miguel took time off work to attend, and their mother, Esperanza, made the difficult trip from their hometown despite her anxiety about entering a courthouse. David had prepared Maria extensively for the questions she might face, but warned her that even with new evidence, the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Maria wore the one nice outfit she owned, a simple blue dress that had been donated to the prison clothing program. Her hands shook as she was escorted into the courtroom, the same room where she had been convicted 5 years earlier. But this time felt different. David sat confidently at the defense table, organized stacks of evidence before him, and Maria could see her family in the gallery for the first time since her sentencing. The prosecutor who had originally tried her case was notably absent. The current district attorney had assigned a younger attorney who seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings, repeatedly consulting notes and looking uncertain about the state's position. The judge, an older woman with a reputation for fairness, listened carefully as David presented the new evidence. Carlos testified via video link from federal custody, his testimony devastating to the original case. He described in detail how Detective Morrison had recruited him as an informant and how the scheme to frame Maria had developed. His story was corroborated by FBI records and recorded conversations that federal investigators had obtained during their own investigation. Detective Morrison, subpoenaed to testify, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to answer questions. His silence spoke volumes, and David argued that the pattern of misconduct extended far beyond Maria's case. The federal investigation had revealed systematic corruption that had tainted dozens of prosecutions over several years. The judge recessed for lunch, leaving Maria and her family to wait in agonizing uncertainty. Miguel held her hand while Esperanza prayed quietly in Spanish, words of gratitude and petition that had been building for years. David remained optimistic but cautious, explaining that even sympathetic judges were reluctant to overturn convictions without overwhelming evidence. When court reconvened, the judge's demeanor had shifted. She spoke directly to Maria, acknowledging the injustice that had been done and the years that had been stolen from her life. The evidence presented today clearly demonstrates that this conviction was obtained through misconduct and perjured testimony, she said. The court has no choice but to vacate the conviction and dismiss all charges. The words hit Maria like a physical force. 5 years of fighting, of maintaining hope against impossible odds, of missing her daughter's childhood, suddenly crystallized into this moment of vindication. She heard Miguel's sharp intake of breath behind her, and felt David's hand on her shoulder as the reality of freedom washed over her. The paperwork took several hours to process, but by evening Maria walked out of the courthouse as a free woman. The media was waiting, drawn by the scandal and the story of wrongful conviction, but David shielded her from most of the questions. There would be time for interviews and statements later. Tonight was for family and the simple miracle of walking wherever she chose to go. Miguel drove her to their mother's house, the same small home where Maria had grown up, but which felt foreign after years of institutional living. Esperanza had prepared Maria's favorite meal, dishes that represented comfort and belonging and all the things that had been missing from prison food. They sat around the kitchen table talking softly about everything and nothing, relearning how to be a family. The strangest part was the silence. After years of constant noise, institutional sounds, and the presence of hundreds of other people, the quiet of a normal home felt almost overwhelming. Maria lay in her childhood bed that first night, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of change. Freedom felt surreal, like a dream she might wake up from. But morning came with sunlight streaming through familiar windows and the sound of birds outside. Maria walked into the kitchen to find her mother making coffee, a normal domestic scene that felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. "What do you want to do today, mija?" Esperanza asked, and Maria realized she could choose her own answer for the first time in 5 years. Freedom was harder than Maria had imagined. The world had moved forward during her 5 years away, and everything felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or using a smartphone overwhelmed her with choices and sensory input. She found herself instinctively looking for guards and permission before making basic decisions like when to eat or where to sit. David had warned her about re-entry challenges, but experiencing them was different from understanding them intellectually. The constant hypervigilance of prison life didn't disappear overnight. Maria jumped at unexpected sounds and felt anxious in crowds. Sleep remained elusive, her body still programmed for institutional rhythms and the need to stay alert for threats that no longer existed. The legal settlement negotiations moved quickly once news of the wrongful conviction spread. The city and police department, eager to avoid prolonged litigation and publicity, offered a substantial financial settlement. David handled the negotiations while Maria focused on the more difficult task of rebuilding her emotional life and finding her place in a world that had continued without her. Isabella occupied her thoughts constantly now that contact was theoretically possible. She would be almost 7 years old, a school-aged child with her own personality and preferences, friendships and fears that Maria knew nothing about. The Johnsons had moved to Colorado, and their attorney made it clear that any reunion would need to be gradual and carefully managed. Isabella knew about Maria but thought of the Johnsons as her parents. Dr. Thompson had connected Maria with a therapist who specialized in trauma and re-entry issues. The sessions helped her process not just the injustice of wrongful conviction, but the more complex grief of lost time and relationships. "You're mourning the life you should have had," the therapist explained. "That's normal and necessary, but you also need to start building the life you can have now." The media attention was both helpful and overwhelming. Maria's story became a symbol for criminal justice reform advocates, and she received hundreds of letters from supporters around the country. Speaking engagements and interview requests poured in, offering opportunities to turn her experience into advocacy work. But the spotlight felt harsh after years of invisibility and institutional anonymity. Miguel had become more serious and responsible during her absence, taking care of their mother and working his way up to shop supervisor at the garage. He treated Maria with a careful kindness that suggested he was still processing his own guilt about their years of separation. "I should have known you were innocent," he said one evening as they walked through their old neighborhood. "I should have fought for you." Their mother had aged visibly during Maria's incarceration, stress and worry etching new lines around her eyes. But she had also found strength in the support group for families of incarcerated individuals, becoming a mentor for other mothers struggling with shame and isolation. Her faith had deepened rather than diminished, and she spoke about God's plan with a confidence that both comforted and challenged Maria. The job search proved more difficult than expected. Despite her bachelor's degree and the publicity surrounding her case, many employers remained hesitant to hire someone with her history. Even with the conviction overturned, the stigma persisted. Maria found herself explaining the situation repeatedly, watching potential employers' expressions change as they processed her story. David connected her with a nonprofit organization focused on criminal justice reform. The executive director, a former prosecutor who had become an advocate after witnessing wrongful convictions, offered Maria a position as a program coordinator. The work involved supporting other exonerees and working with attorneys on wrongful conviction cases. It felt like a way to transform her suffering into something meaningful. The settlement money, while substantial, couldn't restore the lost years or heal the emotional wounds. Maria used part of it to buy a small house near her mother and to establish a college fund for Isabella. whether or not they ever reunited. The financial security was liberating, but it also felt strange to benefit from her suffering. Survivor's guilt was a common experience among exonerees, David explained. Contact with Isabella began through letters mediated by social workers and therapists. Maria wrote carefully crafted messages appropriate for a 7-year-old, sharing pictures of her new life and expressing love without pressure. Isabella's responses were polite but distant, the words of a child who had been coached on how to interact with this stranger, who claimed to be her birth mother. The first phone call was arranged for Isabella's 8th birthday. Maria's hands shook as she dialed the number, not knowing what to expect from this conversation with the daughter she had last held as a toddler. Isabella's voice was higher than Maria had imagined, and she spoke with a slight Colorado accent that reminded Maria how much geography and time had separated them. "The Johnsons say you're my first mom," Isabella said during that initial conversation, her words careful and rehearsed. "They say you couldn't take care of me when I was little, but you love me very much." The explanation was probably the kindest way to explain the situation to a child, but it still stung. Maria was grateful for the Johnsons' sensitivity, even as she grieved for the relationship that had been severed. Therapy helped Maria work through the complex emotions surrounding Isabella. Love and loss, gratitude and resentment, hope and acceptance all swirled together in ways that defied simple resolution. The therapist encouraged her to focus on what was possible rather than what had been lost, to build a relationship with Isabella as she was now, rather than mourning the child who had been taken away, the legal system that had failed. Maria was slowly acknowledging the scope of Detective Morrison's misconduct. A special prosecutor was reviewing dozens of cases, and several other convictions had been overturned. Maria testified before a state legislative committee about the need for reforms to prevent similar injustices. Her voice was steady as she described the human cost of corruption and the importance of accountability. Public speaking became easier with practice, and Maria found her voice as an advocate. She spoke at law schools and police academies, sharing her story not to assign blame but to illustrate the importance of ethical behavior and thorough investigation. Some audiences were hostile, defensive about criticism of law enforcement, but others were genuinely moved and committed to change. The anniversary of her release approached as Maria settled into a rhythm of work, family, and gradual healing. She had been free for 8 months, long enough to stop feeling surprised by simple pleasures like choosing her own clothes or deciding when to eat dinner. The hypervigilance was fading, replaced by a cautious optimism about the future she was building one day at a time. Work at the nonprofit felt meaningful in ways that teaching had never quite achieved. Maria understood the client's experiences from the inside, the particular trauma of wrongful conviction, and the challenges of rebuilding after exoneration. She helped develop programs for housing assistance, job training, and mental health support, drawing on her own struggles to create resources that might have helped her. The relationship with Isabella continued to evolve slowly. Weekly phone calls had become a routine, and Isabella was gradually becoming more comfortable sharing details about her life. She talked about school and friends, her soccer team, and the dog the Johnsons had rescued. Maria listened carefully, building a mental picture of her daughter's world and learning to find joy in Isabella's happiness, even when it didn't include her. A visit was being planned for the summer, when Isabella would come to stay with Maria for a week. The logistics were complex, involving therapists and social workers and careful preparation on both sides. Maria was excited and terrified in equal measure, knowing that this reunion would shape their relationship for years to come. She prepared by child-proofing her house and researching activities that an 8-year-old might enjoy. Miguel had started dating a teacher named Carmen, who worked with children from difficult backgrounds. She understood family trauma and brought a gentle wisdom to their Sunday dinners that helped bridge the gap between Maria's institutional experience and the normal rhythms of family life. Carmen's presence reminded them all that healing was possible and that families could be rebuilt even after devastating losses. The criminal justice reform work connected Maria with a network of advocates and attorneys working on similar cases. She testified regularly at hearings and helped train new lawyers on the signs of wrongful conviction. The work was emotionally draining but also empowering, giving her a voice and preventing others from experiencing what she had endured. Media requests continued, but Maria had become more selective about interviews and appearances. She worked with a publicist to focus on opportunities that advanced criminal justice reform, rather than simply sensationalizing her story. A documentary filmmaker was following several exonerees, including Maria, and she appreciated the thoughtful approach to complex issues rather than simple victims and villains. Dr. Thompson, her former prison therapist, had become a friend and informal mentor. They met monthly for coffee, discussing Maria's progress and the challenges of re-entry. "You're not the same person who went to prison," she observed during one of their meetings. "That woman was a victim. This woman is a survivor who's becoming an advocate. Both versions of you deserve respect and compassion." The statement resonated deeply with Maria, who had struggled to integrate her experiences into a coherent sense of self. Prison had changed her in ways both destructive and constructive. She had lost innocence and naivety, but gained resilience and empathy. The woman she was becoming incorporated both the trauma and the growth, the loss and the possibility of renewal. Legal proceedings against Detective Morrison were moving forward slowly. He faced federal charges for civil rights violations and conspiracy, but the case was complicated by the passage of time and his claimed health issues. Maria tried not to focus too much on his fate, understanding that justice for her didn't require his destruction. Her freedom and vindication were enough. Spring brought new growth in the garden Maria had planted behind her small house. Watching seeds become flowers felt like a metaphor for the slow work of rebuilding her life. Isabella had helped choose some of the plants during their phone conversations, and Maria sent pictures of their progress. The garden would be blooming when Isabella visited, another bridge between their separate worlds. The morning Isabella arrived for her first visit, Maria stood at the airport gate feeling like her heart might burst from her chest. 3 years had passed since her release, and the weekly phone calls had built a foundation of tentative trust between them. But seeing her 11-year-old daughter walk through the terminal, taller and more confident than Maria had imagined, brought back all the grief for the years they had lost and all the hope for what they might still build together. Isabella looked like Maria had at that age, with the same dark eyes and stubborn chin, but she carried herself with the assurance of a child who had been consistently loved and supported. She hugged Maria carefully, politely, the embrace of someone meeting a relative she didn't quite know how to categorize. "You look just like your pictures," Isabella said, and Maria heard the Johnsons' kindness in the way her daughter had been prepared for this moment. The week unfolded like a careful dance between strangers, learning to become family. Maria showed Isabella around the small town where she had grown up, sharing stories about her own childhood, while being careful not to overwhelm her daughter with emotion or expectations. They visited the library where Maria now volunteered with literacy programs, and Isabella met some of the children Maria tutored, kids who reminded her of herself at that age. Isabella was polite and curious, asking thoughtful questions about Maria's work and the criminal justice reform organization. She had been well prepared by her therapist for this visit, understanding in age-appropriate terms why Maria had been unable to care for her as a baby and how the legal system had made a mistake. Her maturity was both impressive and heartbreaking, evidence of the serious conversations she had navigated at too young an age. They cooked together in Maria's small kitchen, making tamales with Esperanza's guidance while 3 generations of women shared stories and laughter. Isabella was fascinated by her grandmother's tales of old traditions and family recipes, asking to write down instructions so she could make them in Colorado. The continuity of culture and family felt healing in ways Maria hadn't expected. The hardest moment came on the 4th day when Isabella asked directly about their separation. "Did you think about me when you were in prison?" she asked as they walked through the garden that was now in full bloom. Maria knelt beside her daughter among the flowers they had chosen together over the phone, trying to find words adequate for such a profound question. "Every single day," Maria said honestly, "I thought about what you might be learning, what games you might like to play, what books you might want me to read to you. I wrote you letters for every birthday and holiday even though I couldn't send them. You were always with me in my heart, even when I couldn't be with you in person." Isabella considered this carefully, her young face serious with the weight of processing complex emotions. "Mrs. Johnson says you loved me enough to let them take care of me when you couldn't," she said finally. "That must have been really hard." The compassion in her voice was remarkable for someone so young, and Maria realized that Isabella was trying to comfort her as much as understand their situation. The Johnsons called every evening, checking on Isabella and maintaining their role as her primary parents while respecting the importance of this reunion. Maria spoke with them briefly each time, expressing gratitude for their care and sensitivity. They had raised Isabella to be kind and confident, qualities that would serve her well in navigating the complexity of having two families who loved her. On their last full day together, Maria took Isabella to the university where she was now pursuing a master's degree in social work. Isabella sat in on one of Maria's classes about family systems and trauma, listening intently as students discussed case studies and intervention strategies. Afterward, the professor commented on Isabella's thoughtful questions and suggested she might make a good social worker herself someday. The goodbye at the airport was easier than either of them had expected. They had found a rhythm together, a way of being mother and daughter that honored both their separation and their connection. Isabella hugged Maria tightly this time, without the careful politeness of their first meeting. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, using the title naturally for the first time, for not giving up and for helping other people now. Maria returned home to find a package waiting from David Yazzie. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Detective Morrison's sentencing to federal prison for corruption and civil rights violations. The article mentioned Maria's case as the catalyst for the investigation that had exposed systematic misconduct. Justice had finally been served, though it felt less important now than the relationship she was rebuilding with her daughter. The nonprofit work continued to expand, with Maria now directing a new program for families affected by wrongful conviction. She trained social workers and attorneys on the specific challenges faced by children whose parents had been wrongfully incarcerated, drawing on her own experience and Isabella's insights to develop more effective support systems. Isabella's visit had been featured in a small article in the local newspaper, focusing on successful reunification after wrongful conviction. The story generated speaking requests from family court judges and child welfare agencies interested in learning from their experience. Maria accepted some invitations, always emphasizing the importance of maintaining connections even during separation and the resilience of children when supported properly. The anniversary of her release had become a day of reflection and gratitude rather than pain. Maria spent it each year volunteering at the prison where she had been incarcerated, speaking with current inmates about education opportunities and maintaining hope. Some of the women she had known were still there, and they treated her visits as inspiration that change was possible even in seemingly hopeless circumstances. Miguel and Carmen had married the previous year, and their first child was due in the fall. The pregnancy brought excitement and some complicated emotions for Maria, who would become an aunt while still rebuilding her relationship with her own daughter. But it also represented hope and continuity, the family growing and healing despite the years of separation and pain. Isabella came for another visit during winter break, this time more confident and relaxed in Maria's home. She helped decorate for Christmas and joined the family traditions that were slowly being rebuilt. The Johnsons sent pictures and updates regularly now, and there was talk of Maria visiting Colorado the following summer. The relationship was no longer just phone calls and letters, but a genuine bond that distance couldn't break. On New Year's Eve, as Maria reflected on the journey from wrongful conviction to freedom to rebuilding, she felt a peace that had seemed impossible during those dark years in prison. Isabella called at midnight to wish her a happy new year, and in her daughter's voice Maria heard not just forgiveness but genuine love and respect. They had found their way back to each other across time and distance and trauma, proof that some bonds are stronger than any system designed to break them. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that prison had taught her never to take for granted. Graduate school, meaningful work, family relationships rebuilt and new ones formed. Isabella's childhood couldn't be recovered, but her adolescence and adulthood could be shared. Maria had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it into a story of survival and hope that could inspire others facing their own impossible circumstances.